Welcome to our podcast from the ground up, where we interview startup founders exploring their journeys, their success, challenges, and lessons learned. We hope you be inspired in discovering what it takes to build a thriving startup. I'm your host, Jake Aaron Villarreal, and excited to have with us today Alex Kruglov, founder of Popin, which is an LA-based startup which has raised $7 million in funding. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. Well, Alex, let me give you a little background of you, and we'll set this up and get into really why you're here to talk about your company. But just a little background on Alex. He graduated magna cum laude from Brown University, received his MBA from Harvard University, and he has been part of the tech industry for some time. He was at Hulu for 6 years that helped launch their launch team, overseeing all of its content acquisition efforts for nearly 500 content providers, including every studio and major network in the US and most major television and film companies in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He's a 3-time entrepreneur and here to talk about his company today, Popin. Alex, before we dive in and start talking about your company, tell us a little bit about where you're from and how did you get into technology?
I was actually born in Ukraine, which was still at the time part of the Soviet Union. And I moved to the States when I was a teenager. I moved to the Boston area. And when I first moved to the States, I didn't speak English. And the way that I ended up not only learning English, but also kind of becoming an American teenager was through pop culture. So I became an obsessive consumer of music, TV shows, watch movies when I could afford them, saved up money to subscribe from my paper route to subscribe to Rolling Stone magazine. And so for me, pop culture was not just a way of enjoying entertainment, but also as a way of kind of joining a community and becoming a part of the American fabric, if you will. So I from a very early sort of age of being a 90s teenager, I was quite focused and obsessive about somehow being part of that world. And I had no idea how, because I wasn't a creative per se. I wasn't a musician or a rock star. I wasn't going to be the next Tom Cruise. And so when I went to college in the late 90s, early 2000s, one of the fields I studied was computer science. And I kind of realized that right at that time when Napster came out, it became reasonably clear, maybe not to adults, but to teenagers, that the intersection of the internet and technology was going to be the future of how creative storytelling was going to sort of be dissipated to the world. So I became quite focused on the sort of that intersection of tech and media. And effectively, other than a stint at McKinsey & Company, which is where I started my career, where I was just kind of generally educated in business in 6 countries around the world. Other than that, I've essentially spent my entire career at that intersection of media, storytelling, and technology.
Storytelling is such a big part of technology. You have to go and create a product, pitch it, present it, solve a problem, and you're telling a story all through that process. When you got into Hulu and you joined Hulu, what was it that made you, excited or, how did that even start? How did you get connected with Hulu?
I had been involved in 2 different startups that I founded when I moved to LA in 2000, permanently in 2006, but I started spending a lot of time in LA starting in 2004. And they were kind of, they had played their course. And I felt like I was a little bit of an imposter in that I had never actually worked in the industry that I was kind of going after. So I got a job at Sony Pictures working in television. And at the time I was thinking, you know what, I'll spend a couple years there, try to learn as much as I can about how, and then I'll bounce out and join a startup or do something else. I also worked at Fox Searchlight briefly. And that future that I was kind of hoping for happened a little bit sooner than expected. I was connected to a gentleman named Jason Kyler, who was the CEO of Hulu. And he reached out and we started talking about the possibility of me joining his team, which at the time, it wasn't called Hulu yet. And it was just essentially an idea around this idea of watching premium video on the internet. And the job that I ended up getting, which is running content acquisition, was one that I was imminently not qualified for at all. But no, the sort of the good news for me at the time is that technically nobody was qualified for it because Netflix, as we know it today, didn't exist, and there's no such concept as licensing television and film for distribution on digital. And Jason had this strong bias at the time to not bring in industry experts because they had a specific way of doing things, and he wanted to invent a new way of doing it from scratch. And so I happened to get very lucky in that I had a little bit of experience in entertainment, like a few months worth, and I was a general athlete who had been an operator, who understood technology, and who had some business background. So I was very fortunate to kind of be not just to kind of end up in a place that worked out, but to also be there at the right time, which was 2007 when I joined Hulu, and it was an exciting ride because it was the first place that I'd been where we had a vision for a consumer offering that no one else agreed with. The nickname for Hulu at the time was Clown Co. And then 6 to 8 months later, where I used to have to spend 3-4 minutes explaining what I did, all of a sudden most people that I would be talking to not only had heard of Hulu but consumed it. The funniest I remember, about 3 or 4 months in, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he is Canadian. He was saying that that's the place where he watches hockey, which was totally not, like, it was a complete afterthought for us at the time, but that felt like something was happening.
That's great. Now, when Hulu launched and became a streaming application and provider, how far along was Netflix? And was that a target that you were looking at as they were building a service and a video content application that kind of was, I don't know, in the same vein that you were building, or kind of how far after did Hulu come around?
Netflix had been around for a long time as a DVD by mail service. And at the time when Hulu launched, Netflix was starting to dip its toe in the water by having some of their movies available on a website for free to subscribers. So it wasn't an extra cost. It was just kind of an extra benefit that they threw out there. We, as the team at Hulu, were deeply aware of it, and we looked at it very closely. But the money behind Hulu and the media companies that were involved with Hulu were not concerned about Netflix at all. Their focus was on piracy, which at the time was a really big deal. So there's a bunch of stuff that nobody remembers, but there were pirate sites like Pirate Bay and Mini Nova that were very popular. Lots of people were downloading HBO shows and stuff like that from there. And Google had just bought YouTube, and there was a real concern that potentially YouTube was going to become the home for premium entertainment, without there being proper compensation for the media companies. So Hulu was really founded with a focus on that. And remember, at the time, you're saying application, which we use that term too, but nobody thought that at the time. It was just a website. There were no mobile devices. There was no iPhone. And certainly no desktop devices. No consoles or television devices where you could watch video. All of that came later.
It makes a lot of sense. It sounds like it was almost like a startup within a bigger company, that you were building something and paving a path, with really no.
Arguably, the reason Hulu worked was because it wasn't that. So it was a joint venture between two media companies, but it was set up as a separate thing with separate funding. So we had our own office, and we had a board of directors, and we had an outside investor that was like a VC type investor, a private equity firm called Providence Equity Partners. And for the first 3 years, we were really set up to run as an independent venture that was not governed by the media companies. And I think that if that hadn't been the case, we wouldn't have been able to kind of start out the gate the way we did. There was also, interestingly enough, there was also a writer's strike back then, which people don't remember as much now, but just like there is today.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's all about content. You had some startups before Popin, 3 mentioned, maybe more than that. Kind of give us a little flavor of the type of startups you had built. Did you have any acquisitions, and kind of give us a little bit more context there?
First startup was when I was in college. I was a co-founder with a couple friends of an online magazine, an online photography magazine. This is back in the late 90s. very early, and the idea of consuming a magazine online was very kind of strange for people. Um, but it was called Glimpse Magazine, and it ended up running for about 8 or 9 years and acquired by National Geographic eventually. So I did not stick around after college because I didn't grow up with any wealth or any money. So it was very important to get a job that paid the bills and had health insurance after college, especially because I have a chronic illness. So that was the first. That was the first startup. My second one was a media company where our biggest contribution to humanity, if you will, was a hip hop musical, the first ever to move to off Broadway. And the feedback that it was a big hit in LA, and then when we moved to New York, the big feedback was that nobody would ever see a hip hop musical in New York. So this is my second time being a little bit too early to something that sort of ended up working out, great success, some number of years later. And then my third startup was the vision behind it was to acquire rights to TV shows and movies from around the world for digital distribution. The problem at the time was not only that had Netflix not launched and Hulu certainly not launched, but even Apple with iTunes only had a music service. So we got the rights, but there was no revenue and no consumers at the time. And then ironically, 18 months later, I was the buyer of the exact same business plan. So I literally shared my business plan with the companies that we were dealing with, who were basically doing the exact same thing 18 months later. So Hulu was the first time where, and it wasn't, obviously I wasn't the founder of Hulu, I was just kind of there early, but it was the first time where I saw an idea that felt like it was a little bit ahead of its time land at the right time. And so timing was definitely a thing that I experienced at Hulu, which timing and luck, in addition to a great idea and great execution, which is a crucial ingredient to startups.
Yeah, timing is essential for almost everything in life, but specifically with startups and funding and going to market and finding the product market fit, all those things, timing is critically important. It's good to be ahead of the curve, not too far and not too
far. That's right.
Late.
Yeah. It's certainly not too late.
Yeah. Talk to us about Popin. This is your current company today. It's been around, we call it a startup. It's been around for 7-8 years. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we first started a company called Smile Time, and it ran for about 5 years. It was a competitor to Twitch with a slightly different value proposition. It was, you could call it a different startup, but technically it's the same company. So we pivoted and started Popin. Smile Time was in the interactive live streaming business. And Popin came, so that did really well and kind of ran its course. And we worked with a number of different media companies, studios, and creators. Whereas with Popin, our goal was to create an ecosystem for consumers, and specifically an ecosystem that allowed humans to connect with other humans without there being production involved and without there necessarily being influencers at play to kind of facilitate the human connection. We had experienced elements of it with our previous startup Smile Time, but our goal with Popin was to figure out how do we create it at scale and how do we do it in a way that is repeatable. And we realized that the kind of games that people play together in groups at game night with friends and family scale themselves to an experience that welcomes human interplay without there being pressure on conversations or politics or toxicity or any of that stuff that sort of permeates online exchanges. So the thing that we had to solve for was one, distance. So how do you create an environment where people feel a sense of presence without being in the same room at the same time? Which you and I are doing right now. And then the second is, how do you get strangers to feel comfortable engaging with other strangers reasonably quickly? And that's basically the vision behind Popin. So it's a gaming platform where people play games together in groups. So it effectively functions as a real-time social network where people play with existing friends, but where they also make new friends and essentially create matchmaking environments where people, get so close on our platform that, we know they take vacations together in the real world, even though they live, half a world away. So that's basically the vision and the execution behind Popin. we call all of that joyful togetherness.
That's great. When you started the first company, Smile Time, and then it evolved, was there a point where you said it ran its course where you had to make a change? Was there a pivot there? Was there any sort of you kind of saw the writing on the wall of the current product and the landscape, and it was time to look at something that was maybe
Yeah,
different? Walk us through
exactly.
that. Yeah.
It was definitely a pivot. So we saw some success, and we saw essentially our vision behind launch for Smile Time was to launch it as a what we what you refer to in business as a B2B2C environment, meaning we partnered with businesses to launch direct to consumer offering powered by Smile Time, but where the push and might was behind big companies like the CW Network and TMZ that had large audiences and had resources and production and could pay us and all that good stuff. And we had some really strong out of the gate success. And then as it continued, we realized that we wanted to become a direct to consumer company and not just power and empower other businesses. And essentially, as we were trying to create that transition, the world of live streaming outside of games, which Twitch owned, was quite nascent. And so once again, we were a little bit early in a space where you saw at scale those kinds of experiences work in China, in Korea, in Japan. Whereas in the US, you saw some live shopping here and there. You definitely saw a lot of live streaming for games, but you didn't see a lot of day-to-day live experience that was interactive pre-COVID. And so we essentially were seeing that we could make a choice. We could continue going down the B2B path and essentially become a partner to studios, networks, and creators. But that was a business that candidly we, the founding team, was not all that excited about doing indefinitely. Or we could pivot and do something else. And we decided to go with the latter choice. And candidly, it was because if we hadn't, we probably would have not stayed together as a team. And doing something together that motivated all of us was a huge priority at the time. So that was the motivation behind it.
That's great. Yeah. Every company seems to have to go through a pivot at some point, whether it's
Yes.
early or later in the stage of their company. And there's unfortunately not a playbook that walks you through how to do it. So what are some of the lessons you've learned in having done that pivot and maybe other pivots that, the listeners might gain some insights from you on?
For sure. Made a lot of mistakes as well. So the biggest learning for me is if you feel you're going to cut early, not late. So the earlier you do the pivot, the better off you are. The simplest reason is because you want to have money in the bank to continue being able to operate. I heard somewhere, so this is not my quote, I didn't come up with this idea, there are only two reasons the startups ever finish. And one is you run out of money, and two is the founders don't get along. And that really kind of resonates. Now, of course, the reason the founders don't get along or the reason you run out of money is because the startup wasn't working. But from a technical standpoint, those are the two kind of reasons. And so you want to avoid both as much as possible. So you want to have disagreements among the founders, but you want them to be creative disagreements. You don't want them to be kill the company type of disagreements. And then you want to be able to continue paying salaries because without it, you won't have the folks that are doing the work. So when it comes to pivoting, the biggest learning definitely is to try to, still have a little bit of money in the bank to be able to build the new prototype of whatever you're building so that your investors come on board. The thing we didn't do is we didn't recap the company. In retrospect, it might have been a good idea to have done that. But I'm a reasonably loyal person, and I felt a sense of loyalty to my investors, and I wanted them to be able to benefit from whatever upside we created. So you could call it a learning, you could call it you could look at it both ways, but that's the thing we didn't do.
Got it. I want to go back to that. You talked about recapping the company. For first-time investors, what does that mean?
So, there's this concept of a cap table, which stands for capitalization table. Cap table is who owns the company. And it's split between the founders, the employees, and of course the investors. And the more money you raise from investors, the larger percentage of the company the investors own. So if the investors invest in company X and then company X says, you know what, we're not going to do that anymore, then the typical way that you go about a recap is to do one of two things. You either say, we're going to shut down company X and we're going to start company Y, and then you're welcome to invest in company Y, but if you don't, that's it. And of course, you open yourself up to potential lawsuits and stuff like that from investors if you were to do that. Another way to do a recap is to say, from now on, we're going to issue a bunch of new equity that will essentially dilute the existing investors, and then existing investors have the opportunity to buy into the new company under the new equity structure or not. And if they don't believe in the new thing, then they essentially get washed out. And if they do, then they get a piece of something new. This is what had the most famous example of this was when Twitter pivoted away from a company called Audio, which was a podcasting business, which wasn't working because they were too early to podcasting. And when they became Twitter, they essentially recapped the company and washed out a lot of the Audio investors.
Yeah. We invest in companies too. We're part of one of those recaps. So I understand it, but it's
not great from an investor standpoint.
No, you don't feel very good about it, but you want to still have some ownership in the
Yes.
future of what that could be. So you're kind of in between a rock and a hard place.
Yes. I do have investors now that invested, 7 or 8 years ago and that barely even know what we're doing because they're, individuals and it wasn't a very big check. So it's kind of interesting to sort of, keep updating them as to what we're up to and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we'll see what happens.
You talked about getting along with your partners as potentially being one of the issues that can stop a startup. How many partners do you have today, and have they been with you from the beginning? 2
co-founders of Popin, and they've been with me from a large chunk of Smile Time, and definitely, we conceived Popin together. One is a gentleman named Rory McKenna. He's our chief technology officer. The other one is Alex Kruglov, who is kind of a jack of all trades, but our head of product.
Yeah, that's great. It's hard to find partners. How did you find your partners?
So they were not the co-founders of Smile Time, the original Smile Time, but they were. Alex was one of my very first hires, and Rory was reasonably soon after. The people talk a lot about culture fit, and to me, that's a little bit of a nonsensical statement in the early days of a startup because by definition, you don't have a culture. You just have a vision, and you want to be able to build a team. And my general perspective from a hiring standpoint is that I only want to hire people who are at least 10 times better than me at the thing that I am hiring them to do. So I couldn't do their job, and they can't do what I do. But the thing that they do, they have to be dramatically better than me, so I can learn from them. Mark Zuckerberg has this line that I like, but don't quite agree with, which is that you want to be able to work for the person who you hired to work for you. There's something there, but that assumes that you're essentially doing the same thing. Whereas I'm a big believer in hiring, 10x engineers, 10x product people, 10x designers, 10x marketers, whoever it is for the role, so that they can feel very comfortable and secure in the role that they're doing, and they feel motivated to contribute. So I'm overhead. So I'm essentially a person who kind of knows about everything that's going on in the company, but who doesn't directly own any of the specific functional areas. And I'm sensitive to the fact that I need to sort of play my part, and we need to essentially together with the co-founders and with the whole team, there needs to be, it's a little bit of a jazz orchestra where the pieces aren't written, but you want to sound good together somehow. And I'm sort of the conductor of a jazz orchestra, which I understand makes the analogy faulty because a typical jazz orchestra doesn't have a conductor, but that's effectively my role.
Yeah, that's great. We are a believer internally that when we interview people, we talk to them, and I've interviewed over 20,000 people personally for our company. We put people to work. That's what we do for startups and bigger companies. But I always ask when we hire our own people, could I see myself working for that person? Like when we're interviewing, whether they're junior, mid-level, or senior, could I get along with them? And could I actually see myself at some point, maybe not today, but could I listen to them and take direction from them? And would I feel good about that? And that's kind of one of the litmus tests is if that's Zuckerberg, that's great. I didn't really think about that, but there's some to that. I don't think it's 100% proof, but it certainly is one of our gauges.
I have a slightly contrarian view to that because certainly not my co-founders, but there's certainly individuals on the team that are individual contributors rather than managers. And there are some individual contributors who are not necessarily cut out to be managers, but they're amazingly good at what they do. So my general perspective is you want them to be truly great at the thing you want them to be doing, and you want to see a path for them to be truly great for at least, let's call it 3 years. And I'm kind of okay. My other thing that I sort of think about a lot is when you're competing with the world's greatest technology companies on hiring, and you can't afford to pay, you can't afford to pay more, but you can't pay as much as they do. How do you hire great people? So we're not willing to compromise on quality, but we are willing to compromise on just about everything else. Location, hours, meaning like they could work weird hours, like in the middle of the night. Some engineers are into that. And also, we're more than happy to hire kind of quirky, weird individuals who have strange preferences and might not have a typical profession, hygiene, in terms of working in a large office. And so, we have folks, folks all around the country, one person in Vietnam. So we're sort of, you kind of want to be able to play to your strengths when it comes to being a startup.
Yeah. One of the mistakes we see with a lot of the companies and startups that we work with is as they grow and they end up scaling up is sometimes you get the best individual contributor at something and you put them into a management role because they're
not necessarily qualified. Yeah.
Right. And we look at it as two ladders. You have one ladder, individual contributors, and one ladder as leadership. And you need to ask people early on in their career, what is it they want to do? What ladder do they want to be on? So they could be individual contributor. At some point, they want to cross over and go up a different ladder of leadership. But if you put the wrong person in a role that they don't believe they should be on that ladder, they're never going to be happy. And you can put them back into the other ladder and they are all of a sudden very happy. So I think it's important to understand as you're building your company, what ladder do you want to put people on and be clear about it? Because that's when people leave. They're not happy. They don't like the responsibility. So that's really interesting to kind of hear your thoughts. I had a question for you. If you were to rank what's most important, just 3 items. One is getting your hiring strategy right, meaning hiring the right people. That's 1. 2, getting your product strategy right, meaning building the right product. Or 3, getting your leadership strategy right, hiring the right leaders in your company. Which one of those 3, they're all essential, would you rank maybe tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3?
That's very tricky because, you asked the question in a way that was intended to be non-obvious. So the 3, just to repeat. So 1 is hiring, 1 is leadership, 1 is product. Is that right? Those are the 3?
Yeah.
You're going to pivot the product. So I think that, I would put that last with a strong caveat. So I'm a big believer in two-way doors, in sort of understanding these concepts that Jeff Bezos talks about of two-way doors versus one-way doors. So what you don't want to do is to early on go from a product standpoint, go into a one-way door, meaning a door that you can't go back out of and make sort of an early wrong product decision that's very difficult to recover from. And product is not just consumer facing, it can also be a technical solution to your architecture of your technology company. But aside from that, it's easy to pivot the product, and products can be changed. So counterintuitively, I would put people ahead of leaders. So I would put people, then leaders, then product. And the reason I would put people ahead of leaders is because I think most business books and sort of folks who talk about strategy and startups and all of that talk a lot about leadership and not enough about individual contributors. And unless you actually have people who are doing the actual work, who are very, very good and motivated and ideally self-motivated and sort of push above and beyond, it's very, very difficult to have your head above the water and to be able to feel confident with sort of the execution. So leadership is crucial, but I put some of that burden on myself, meaning I don't necessarily need 3 or 4 tiers of leadership. I can sort of step in and help out on an as needed basis. And I've definitely become, the more, the longer I live in the startup land, the more I've become a believer in having world-class individual contributors ahead of, especially what we don't have for sure because we're small, but even in a place like, at a bigger company, I'm really not a big fan of managers who have managers under them, who have managers under them, who then kind of have individual contributors kind of 3 or 4 levels down. So leadership is a tenuous term, but I would put that second, world class builders first, and product, which is crucially important, especially in a consumer business. I would reluctantly put that third.
Got it. That's great. I actually agree with you in that process. What insights could you share that help you get the hiring process right, getting the right people on the team? Like, what have you learned over the years? You've been doing this for a while in multiple companies that you kind of know, here's the mistakes I've made, here's how I can get it right, and what would be helpful for others to learn?
This is again where we have a very counterintuitive process. We probably do it differently from most. So when I've worked at bigger companies, the process is kind of long interviews, multiple rounds, lots of people to really validate the individual. And I never liked that process because I find that being good at interviewing is not necessarily the same skill set of being good at your job. There's interview prep courses at, McKinsey, where I started my career. There's a case interview, and case interview is as much about the skill of being good at case interview as it is about actually being good at the potential job. Quick aside, my wife, after having worked at McKinsey for 6 years and not only been a senior person there, but also having conducted multiple case interviews where she was the interviewer. She interviewed for a company whose name I won't mention, and the person who was interviewing her gave her a case. And this person worked briefly at a different consulting firm years earlier, much more junior than my wife was. Anyway, this person felt like she didn't do very well at the case interview and didn't continue the process beyond that. So just kind of goes to show kind of how that sort of consulting process works. Anyway, so I had been dissatisfied with the long interview process, and I wanted to come up with a better solution. Long story short, our approach is very simple. If we get a sense after 2 or 3 people talk to an individual for a half hour that potentially there's something there, we give them a project. We pay them for that project. So we don't ask them to work for free. We pay them on a sort of the equivalent of a contractor or consulting basis to do the project. And they effectively work for us for a period of anywhere between 2 and 8 weeks, depending on the individual, depending on what the role is, and so on. And that gives them the opportunity to interview us and to figure out whether they want to work with us. And it gives us the opportunity to see whether they actually can do the work and whether whether this person can fit as part of the team. And then at the end of that process, we go into a full-time offer or not.
Do you have certain traits you try and look for in anybody that you bring on board?
That's a tricky question because it kind of depends on the role. But the simple way I would describe it is if I have a perception of where the bar should be, I want them to exceed the bar. Because this goes back to what I said earlier, which is I want them to be 10 times better at the job than I would be. And generally, in a small startup, I can sort of do most things that people do. I haven't coded, even though I studied computer science somewhat as an undergrad, I haven't coded professionally, but I can code a little. I can certainly read code, but I can't code, right? So that's kind of the thing I can do the least. But, things like marketing, certainly things like product, I can do some of it. And so and then, of course, as we have individuals who are much better than me, I can see the bar that they're setting. And so when we're hiring somebody, we have an idea as to kind of what, kind of a cut line of what we think they should be doing. And I always want them to be far ahead of that cut line.
Got it. That's great, I think. I want to dive a little bit deeper into Popin. So This is a product you've built. Talk to us a little bit about how big it's gotten. What's the user community like? If you are not a user of the application, what could you benefit from using it?
The biggest, the thing that I use, so I can say all kinds of things of praise for my own product, but I really, spend a lot of time talking to our users, and our team does too, and hearing from them kind of what is their feedback and how would they put it. And we have this wonderful luxury of essentially having constant real-time focus groups that are going on in the app at all times because it's an app where people can turn on audio and speak to you and video in certain games as well. So we can effectively run real-time focus groups, as people are playing, and they can kind of tell you what's going on. There's never a time when there's a bug in the app when our users don't tell us about it within seconds. So it's wonderful to be,
That's cool.
to be in the middle of a romantic dinner with my wife and getting a ping saying, something's broken. Oh shit. Okay. We got to get into it. Apologize for swearing. So I would say that the biggest kind of definitional element of Popin is a sense of community. So if you, Jake, were to download the app and join one of our, we have you can play individual games anytime with your friends and family, but we have these scheduled events that are happening on a daily basis, kind of on the hour, starting around 4 p.m. Pacific. And if you are new, meaning somebody hadn't seen you before. So not necessarily you're new to the app, but if you're new to them, they'd be like, oh, whatever your username is, what's going on? Do you know how to play? Have you played spades before? Let me show you how to play spades, or whatever game you're playing. And there's this real sense of inclusivity, and there's a sense of, even though, we've gotten to a significant scale, there's a real sense of like intimacy because most games are played in tables of 4. So, you really get to kind of feel a sense of connectivity with the humans that you're playing with. Now, the experience, one of the downsides is this, some people are introverted. They don't necessarily want to be talking to a whole bunch of people. So we're sensitive to that. And you can play any of the games without turning on your mic or your camera, and you're just kind of an avatar and you're playing. But what tends to happen is you win a round and then everyone turns on their mic and they say, hey, Jake, good game, good for you. And so all of a sudden you kind of want to turn on your mic and say, oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And all of a sudden you find yourself by the end of the game session letting them know what the name of your cat is and so on. So it's funny where, it's easier for extroverts to immediately jump into the app, but the people that we retain the most tend to be introverts because they feel like, they feel recognized, and they feel a sense of community, and they feel like they can kind of control how much and whether they engage with other humans. So, the thing that I'm most proud of is a sense of community and a sense of engagement of our ecosystem. So a typical our core metric that we pay the most attention to is not time spent on the app, but time playing with other humans. That's the core metric. And, we're seeing that when people play, they tend to play, an hour and a half or so per day. We always want them to go outside or to go hang out with their family or to go to a dinner party or whatever else. But when you happen to be, alone at your house, there's this real sense of presence and a real sense of community that you can join.
That's I think it's great. I mean, in this remote world that we've been in since the pandemic, you work from home, you do things in your house. There's that social connection that you don't get as much maybe as you used to.
Yes.
So any game that you can play is great, and if you can connect with others, I think that's even better. Do you actually see them? Like, can you join a game and are you seeing people before you join?
It's fully integrated. So essentially the easiest way to think about it is like, think about a tabletop game, right? Where, people are playing cards around a table and marry that with FaceTime. That's kind of what it looks like.
Oh, okay.
So it's a full screen on your mobile phone. And, some people, don't turn on their video and so you don't see them. So they just show up as whatever avatar, it's either a photo of themselves or like a cartoon avatar, that we provide for you that looks really cool. It's slick. But absolutely people can join on video and they can have, a nice chat. And we have a lot of tools around safety and around community to really make sure that if there are bad seeds that join, that they're quickly weeded out of the app. And we're not a libertarian open to all platforms. So if people misbehave, they get kicked out and they can't come back. It's funny because people think gaming and so they think about, they think it's a bunch of 16-year-old boys. But I would say our core user is probably like a 29-year-old mom who 3 years earlier would maybe go clubbing or go on dates, on her Thursday night. And now it's 8:00 and, she put her kid to bed and she kind of wants to, hang out with a bunch of people, and she can do that without having to put on a bunch of makeup.
That's great. I love it. What's the business model?
The business model, so we don't have ads, and the business model is around microtransactions. So users can play for free. It's completely free to play, and they have the opportunity to earn our currency, which we call pops, by doing well and by playing a lot. But there's also a bunch of things that you can buy inside of the app, a bunch of merch. Some of it is physical merch, like this T-shirt that I'm
Yeah.
wearing, and this water bottle, but much of it is digital merch. Just like you have in lots of other free to play games. So if you want to kind of pimp out your experience, you can spend, and if you don't, then it's completely free to play. We're also introducing a feature in the coming weeks that we're really excited about, which kind of continues to go down the path of what we call joyful togetherness and community, that we're going to be calling kudos. And the idea there is that people can buy these emotions to gift to others. So somebody can be gifted as a thank you. They're very helpful, they're very funny, and they can wear those as a badge. So you can buy them, but you can't give them to yourself. You can only get them from others by being good individuals. And so those cost the buyer. They don't cost anything to the receiver. So it's just another little fun thing that we're playing with.
That's really cool. Yeah, loneliness is such a big problem to solve, and it causes a lot of mental, maybe it's not mental illness, maybe there's just like things that are going on in your life where, you're out of a relationship, or you want that sense of community and you don't always know where to get it, and
Our
I
Surgeon
always,
General is referring to loneliness as an epidemic. I would argue that loneliness is a dramatic problem, and it is especially a problem. I'm a parent of three children. One of them is a teenager, and thankfully she's back to normal when it comes to school. But there's especially with the pandemic or post-pandemic, but even before the pandemic, there's a strong sense of loneliness among community. There's much less family among people who are under 40. People are less connected to their friends. People move around, and so anything that we can do to contribute to human togetherness. And again, in-person human togetherness is always better than not in person, but we can't always, experience that as humans. And so delivering joy to people is absolutely our core mission.
there's other applications and platforms out there, social networks, but it seems like you've carved out a niche. Who would you say is your biggest competitor today in this area?
Well, it kind of depends what category you're looking at. So if there are certainly many gaming companies that are out there, and most of them don't have much human interaction. But hardcore AAA games, people play with headsets and they're talking to other players that they're playing against. So a game like Fortnite would certainly be in the category of potential competition to us for certain category of users. Now, Fortnite is not necessarily welcoming to a very casual gamer, but it absolutely is in the same competitive set, and it is a place where people hang out. Those games, that game and a number of others tend to be much more skewered towards people talking to people they already know, rather than kind of making new friends or meeting new people. And so in that world, and there's obviously lots of dating apps which are around dating, and so we're not directly in the romantic dating space, but we call what we do to some extent as kind of platonic long distance dating amongst friends. So you could say that the dating apps are in our competitive set. And then there's also locally based meetup type of experiences where people meet up to play trivia night at a bar or whatever else. And so we respect them and we want them to do really well. But you could argue that they're in a competitive set. I would argue that social networks, even though they're called social networks, are not very social. They're just mostly feeds of things that you consume and scroll through. When it comes to actual human interaction, that's not what they do. The exception to that probably is Snapchat, where the majority of engagement on Snapchat actually happens with people, interacting with other people. But again, that tends to be mostly focused on existing friends and existing friend groups rather than new folks.
Yeah, I hear you. That's cool. I have two young boys, and I know that gaming, even at a young age, they're both under 8, but they're already getting into games, and you can kind of lose people when they get too focused and they're kind of on their own doing it.
It's funny. My 10-year-old, what she does is she essentially recreates Popin, but on Roblox. So what she does is she gets on the iPad, she FaceTimes with her real world friends on the iPad, and then while they're on FaceTime, they open up Roblox and they tell each other which server and which game they're at and which game they're playing. And so they see each other on Roblox where you can't talk to each other, but they're talking to each other on FaceTime. So essentially, that's basically what Popin is. She just kind of, hacks it.
That's really cool. So is there like an age range? You said females typically 29 or older. You seem to be like,
that's like most... if you kind of have that, the target, like that's like our sweet spot. It tends to be out of college is our typical kind of age range. Meaning, in college, it's about as social an experience as you can possibly have. Not necessarily, people who are actually in college. I'm not talking about everyone who's college age. So it tends to be sort of out of college. It tends to be a little bit more female than male because our games are casual, but it's about 56-44 female male ratio. We don't let anybody under 17 join just because the possibility of being on audio and video, the threat associated with the potential of negative behavior, we think of that threat as bigger than the benefit that we could offer that community. But that's the basic. That's kind of we probably have a big chunk of folks that are kind of in the young parent age, and then we have another chunk that's not insignificant that are kind of empty nesters where their kids are not out of the house. And we have some grandmas, and the grandmas are very active. They ask a lot of questions. They're not necessarily the most technically savvy, but they're very active.
That's great. What type of games are on the platform today? What are your most popular games?
Our typical games are real world games that you're familiar with that you play in groups. We actually started out with a game that wasn't very well known called Liar's Dice. That was our first game. And it's kind of like a poor man's poker, but you play it with, rolled dice. People might have seen it in Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's mentioned in the book Liar's Poker by Michael Lewis. But it's not a super well known game. And one of the side effects of having a game that isn't super well known, but having lots of human interaction, is that we learned that our best onboarding is like another human teaching you how to play, which is much better than reading a tutorial. So that was kind of our first experience when we kind of were in the beta of Popin. Today, our most popular games are probably Spades and Dominoes. Cool. And the other game that I was kind of surprised that we did as an experiment, but has really worked out for us, is actually crosswords. So we partnered with the Hearst Corporation. They provide us with a bunch of daily crosswords. And what's interesting is that we essentially created the only mode on mobile that you can get on the App Store and Play Store, the only time that you can play crossword with other humans. Which, if you think about it, is if you are working on your Sunday crossword and you don't know a clue, you just ask someone who is next to you, like, hey, do you know what word that starts with U and ends with A that protects you from rain or whatever, right? And they tell you it's umbrella. But now there's actually a bunch of humans who are playing with you at the same time. And it's both collaborative and competitive. So it's really fun to do crossword together with other humans.
That's great. God, I got to share this with my family. We're local in SoCal and also in Northern California. So yeah, I can really get some good evenings together and some good family time, which we can't get all the time. I think that would be really fun to do.
Nice.
What's one of the problems, or not problems, but one of the challenges you didn't anticipate when you started Popin? I know you transitioned it, but when you transitioned to Popin, what's something that you've learned that you didn't anticipate that you've had to solve for, and you feel like it's insightful that you could share with the listeners?
One thing that's very interesting is that what is our biggest strength is also arguably one of our bigger weaknesses. So the thing that you hear from our users, especially our active users, the best thing about Popin is that I met my new best friend on here. The best thing about Popin is that I formed these amazing relationships with people from all around, and I got to know them, and I feel so close to them. So that seems wonderful, right? Like, why would that be a negative? Well, the negative is that sometimes, and this goes back to loneliness, this goes back to kind of quirky individuals, sometimes they don't necessarily want to bring people from their real world into this experience. So sometimes the fact that it's an escape, the fact that it's an opportunity to connect with others, the side effect of that is they don't necessarily have a strong incentive to go bring 10 of their real world friends into the app, as opposed to on Fortnite, where you need a crew to kind of play with, of existing friends. And so there's a variety that's kind of built in. So we are sensitive to the fact that we don't want to kind of force users to connect with their real world friends. On the other hand, we want to have a strong word of mouth growth ecosystem where there's virality that's kind of built into the app. And walking that fine line is definitely non-trivial.
Gotcha. If someone wanted to find Popin or connect with you, where would they go?
Well, the good news is our name is literally our URL. So pop.in is our website. So if you go there, it will show you the links to download in the Play Store and in the App Store, or you can just obviously search for them. We have an Instagram and a Twitter handle. They're not very active, but we have them. And if you want to follow me, I'm A. Kruglov on most.
That's great. Well, as we wrap up here, Alex, I want to thank you for your time today and joining us. And also want to thank the listeners for spending your time listening to stories about startups. And hopefully you got some insights out of here. I certainly did. I look forward to catching up with you in the future, Alex, and seeing how Popin goes and how you grow. And to all our listeners on the next episode, enjoy the rest of your day. And until next time, peace out.
Thank you so much.
Before we wrap up, I want to give a big shout out to all the entrepreneurs that have joined to make this podcast possible. And for all the listeners for listening. It means the world to me that you chose to spend your time with us today. I'm your host, Jake Aaron Villarreal, signing off for now, but can't wait to connect with you all soon on the next episode. Take care. This show is sponsored by Match Relevant, a company that helps venture-backed startups find the best people in the market, and they do it in 3 simple steps. First, they sit down with founders to understand their story. Second, they tell their story into multiple candidate channels. And third, they schedule interviews within 48 hours. Find us at matchrelevant.com to learn more about how we do it.